Hello everybody, welcome to Project Dits here on YouTube, and I finally have some original content for you guys to absorb, to hopefully enjoy. And we're doing it with, well, an easy entry point for me to ease my way back into this kind of stuff. My Wrestling Fandom, which is also the name of the series, funny old thing. I've always found people's stories of how they got into wrestling, their continued fandom of wrestling throughout the years, or how they've even detached themselves from wrestling. I've always found that kind of stuff really interesting, and I hope that you guys can marry up with my story. But we'll see how it goes. But this is a multi-part thing, you know. I'm not just going to sit here for an hour and yabber on about why I like wrestling, you know. I'll release it in parts because that's what smart people do. And nobody wants to be bored for an hour. I'm going to bore you for about 5 minutes instead after this intro. But this is, of course, part 1, if you didn't quite get that from the title that I just put up there. This is part 1, but it's also a prequel, kind of, to part 1. Every good story has a prequel, and this one is no different. I became a wrestling fan in 1998 during the Attitude Era. That was my proper entry point into the world of wrestling. However, there is a prequel to this tale, so I guess this is actually part 0.25, but we'll wing it. We'll say it's part 1. Star Wars got away with doing strange trilogy numbers, so can I. And we kick things off as a 6-year-old Dits, a mini Dits, knowing nothing about wrestling. None of my family were interested in wrestling, or at least I wasn't aware of any fandom of wrestling through the family. So I was none the wiser, didn't know anything about it. And at this point, my dad used to work away. He was in the military, so he was never at home. Like, he was always away. And my mum would work late, so she was never home for me to go to after I finished school. So I always ended up going around to my grandparents' place. You know, it wasn't always fun there. You know, I didn't have my consoles there. I don't know what I had. I think it must have been a Sega Saturn or a PlayStation at that point. But I didn't have any of the stuff that I really enjoyed. I had like kids TV, like post-school kids TV on CITV or CBBC, whatever it was. I had that, but then as soon as that was finished and the news came on, I was game over. So I always had to find ways to entertain myself. And one of those ways was in the shop that my granddad actually owned. So his house was above the shop. And it was a collector's shop on the corner of the street. And, you know, you put 2 and 2 together and you call that shop Collector's Corner. Very smart. It was full of crap. For me, like, you know, to somebody else, that place was a gold mine. But for me, it was just full of crap. Postcards, cigarette cards, old, like, picture. It was full of rubbish. There were some gems in there. Like, I'm not going to completely put this place down. Like, they had old Star Wars and old Star Trek toys. Like, back when toys were metal, which in hindsight is probably not the best thing to do for a kid's toy. I guess, was it really a kid's toy or was it down as a collectible? I don't know. But it was cool to see, like, go down there and play with the Enterprise. Probably shouldn't have played with it, but I was playing with the Enterprise. I broke a Millennium Falcon. He still doesn't know about that to this day. But in there as well, he also had a collection of VHS tapes. Yeah, VHS tapes. It covered an entire wall. It was just full of the OG Star Trek series, Flash Gordon, Doctor Who, and one other thing. Well, obviously there was a lot more things, but there was one other thing that caught my attention as a 6-year-old mini Dits. And I pulled it, because I pulled everything out because I was curious what it was, but I happened to pull this thing out. And on the front of it was 2 guys having a fight. And I was like, what is this? Because this looks interesting. There's a guy who seemingly is a policeman, and there's this dude here in yellow trunks and bald with strange blonde hair, which doesn't quite match the fact that he's bald, and a mustache, and I was like, this is a little bit strange. And the image on front of that VHS was this one. And this happened to be the very first bit of wrestling that I ever watched. Ever. And looking back, I find that strange because I've never gone back to the Federation era of wrestling and gone back and watched this stuff. Nor have I ever been a fan of Hulk Hogan. And this VHS tape just happened to be Hulk Hogan's like greatest matches or greatest moments, whatever it was, because there was a collection of them. There was like 3 VHS tapes. And the first ever match that I ever watched as a 6-year-old boy was the Big Boss Man versus Hulk Hogan in a steel cage match. And I want to say it was Saturday night's main event is where it was. But if you've just seen the pictures, you kind of know what that is. I took it upstairs and I watched it, and on this tape as well, you had I think they had the Andre the Giant match from WrestleMania where he slammed him. I was always Team Andre, by the way. Screw Hogan. Like, even though Hulk Hogan was my entry point to wrestling, never a fan. Never a fan. I just don't know what it was. I was always more cheering for the guys he was against, like Big Boss Man. I just remember being blown away by everything that I was seeing, because I'd never seen wrestling before. I'd never played any wrestling video games, because I'm sure there were some out by the time, like the old WrestleMania games. I'd never played any of those before. I played fighting games, obviously, but it's not wrestling, is it? So this was new and exciting. You know, I was genuinely interested in what I was seeing. I was invested in what I was seeing, because I went down as soon as I finished that tape and watched the rest of them. I watched all of them over the course of that week because I needed something to do, but it was something that actually kept me going back. That was my entry point to wrestling, which is, like, when I think about it, because I don't really enjoy the Federation era of wrestling, that being the way I got into it, you know, is not really the way I thought I would. Like, the Attitude Era is, you know, for guys my age, you know, is the entry point. You know, when you've got your Austins, your Rocks, your Undertakers, your Triple H's, all those guys, DX running around, that, and WCW as well, the Monday Night Wars, that was their entry point into wrestling, guys my age. But the Federation era was my time, really, in prequel realm. And I call it a prequel simply because after I watched these tapes, I never watched wrestling until the Attitude Era. So I watched those tapes and I never watched them again. I don't know why. I don't know why I did. I just never went back to them, even though I enjoyed it. And it wasn't until I got to the Attitude Era, like 2 years later, when I was like, right, this is a lot different than those tapes I watched a couple of years ago. This is where it's at. That's where it was. And that's a whole new kettle of fish. That Attitude era stuff is a whole new kettle of fish, because you talk about me as a 6-year-old enjoying Big Boss Man, Hulk Hogan, Steel Cage, and, you know, enjoying it and being very, very curious about it. And then the Attitude Era coming along with The Rock. He was my guy, and still is. The Rock. Like, 6-year-old, 8-year-old Dits. Like, completely different viewpoints of what I was watching. And because I guess what I was watching was so different, and I gravitated a lot more towards the Attitude Era. But we'll do that in part 2. This was kind of like the prequel, the setup, the welcome to the series kind of thing. I think you got to ease people in with these things. So next week on these will release weekly, but over the weekend, so Friday, Saturday, or Sundays, we'll go into what took me into the Attitude Era of my wrestling fandom. But this was my entry point, kind of. I still don't regard this as my main entry point, because I never became a fully fledged fan of wrestling after watching these tapes, but it did bring me to the dance, kind of, with Hulk Hogan. Don't like him. I don't like him. But if you do want to find out, you know, what got me into wrestling properly, because that is the first real proper episode of this series in the Attitude Era, then subscribe to the channel, like this video, and then just wait a week. Just wait a week. Or if you're watching this on demand, you can literally just go, boop, episode 2. It is that simple. It's that simple. But thank you guys for checking this out. Nice little introduction into the series, and I'll see you when I yabber on about the Attitude Era. So until then, ciao ciao.